Good evening. My name is Joanne Drake, for those of you that do not know me, and I serve as the Chief Administrative Officer for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. In honor of our men and women in uniform who serve this country around the world, it is our tradition to ask that you stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Be seated. Well, welcome to the Air Force One Pavilion. We are very privileged tonight to be in this room, thanks to the United States government shutdown. But it's a pretty good gig, so we're going to take it. I want to welcome all of you here, but we have a special guest tonight, a very dear friend of mine and dear friend of the Reagans. Lou Cannon is here with his wife, Mary. Thank you for coming, Lou. And our special guest this evening, Scott Berg, was born on the East Coast, but was raised in California. As a high schooler at Palisades High, many of you may recognize that, he discovered the world of F. Scott Fitzgerald when he was doing a research report. It turns out that his mother was also a huge fan of Fitzgerald, and in fact had named her son in part for him. As a teenager, Scott was so intrigued by F. Scott Fitzgerald's life and books that he became determined to apply to Princeton University, Fitzgerald's alma mater. Scott did graduate from Princeton University in 1971, and you can definitely feel his fondness for that Ivy League campus as you read all about Princeton University in the Woodrow Wilson book. Scott hails from a very talented family. His father, Richard, was a prominent film and television producer. His older brother, Jeff, is the head of ICM. His younger brother, Tony, is a musician, a composer, and an actor. And in fact, his daughter, Z. Berg, has become a notable indie pop musician in her own right. But Scott is not just a writer. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. He has become a biographer's force to reckon with, previously authoring 4 bestsellers on iconic Americans. And I feel strongly that this will be a bestseller as well. He was quoted once as saying that, "I think it would be interesting, perhaps, to spend a career writing a half-dozen biographies of 20th century American cultural figures. Each one, as I often use as my metaphor, a different wedge of the great apple pie." Well, the first piece of the Scott Berg pie was on legendary literary editor Maxwell Perkins, which he wrote in 1978, and for which Scott received the National Book Award. I'm sure it's not a coincidence that Perkins was the editor for the likes of Ernest Hemingway, Thomas Wolfe, and yes, F. Scott Fitzgerald. The second Berg biography was on filmmaker Samuel Goldwyn in 1989. And then in 1998, the life of aviator Charles Lindbergh captured his imagination, and this extraordinary work resulted in both the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Scott Berg. The fourth wedge of his apple pie was the biographical memoir of Katharine Hepburn, entitled Kate Remembered, which was published only weeks after her death and became a #1 bestseller for most of the summer of 2003. It is believed that Scott Berg has become popular with the mainstream audience because of his treatment of his subjects, and I can attest to that after having read this book. In each of his biographies, according to the reviews, 3 essential qualities exist: the sweeping away of myth and legend to unveil a living, breathing human being behind the image, his meticulous scholarship, aided by a remarkable ability to gain access to previously unavailable sources, and finally, the elegant, fluent prose that makes the books so easy to read. Scott's new book on our nation's 28th president has all of that and much more. Although it is his first book in more than 10 years, once you get engrossed in the story, you will start to ask yourself how he managed to winnow this new biography of President Wilson down to the size that he has. And it's really not that small. I am by no means a traditional student of history, but I am a willing student of the presidency and certainly of Ronald Reagan. And I pride myself in trying to learn something new every day about each of the people who has held the office of the president. But when I first saw this biography, entitled simply Wilson, I was a little fearful of the daunting task ahead of me to get through the book before Scott arrived this evening. But every minute and every word was both intriguing and engaging, and I encourage each and every one of you to get started. Throughout my life and in the course of history, classes in school, in college, and high school, I have only known of President Wilson, probably like many of you, as a stern academician who was in charge when the U.S. both got into World War I and then got out. And like most of you, I knew of his 14 points and the Versailles Treaty. But Thomas Woodrow Wilson, while not on the top of anyone's most popular president's list, was much more important and influential in our country's and the world's history than many of us probably realize. The year 2013 marks 100 years since Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as president, and Scott Berg is the first biographer to have been allowed access to 2 new collections of papers to write of this extraordinary period in our nation's history. In addition to the extensive Wilson archives at the Library of Congress and the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library in Staunton, Virginia, Scott Berg was allowed to go through the letters of Dr. Cary Grayson, who was President Wilson's personal physician and one of his most trusted friends until the day he died. And also Jessie Wilson Sayers' collection, who was the second of 3 daughters of Woodrow and Ellen Wilson, the president's first wife. This material provides new and sometimes very intimate details of the president's life. It uncovers unknown events and ultimately gives us a new perspective on Woodrow Wilson. As one reviewer has said, Scott Berg's new book is the most intimate and incisive biography ever written of Wilson, long viewed as a cold and aloof intellectual, but revealed by Berg to be a man of intense passion, emotional turbulence, and hidden political skill. And as Scott himself observed in a recent op-ed piece in the New York Times, the central political conflicts of his era continue to play out even today, and uncannily echo many of those faced by President Barack Obama. Did you know, for instance, that Woodrow Wilson created the Federal Reserve Board and established the Federal Trade Commission? Did you know that he was the president who supported women's suffrage and saw the 19th Amendment become a reality in this country? Were you aware that he was the president that appointed the first Jew to the Supreme Court? Did you know that he's the only U.S. president to be buried within the borders of the District of Columbia in the National Cathedral? And it seems we have him also to thank, or criticize, as the case may be, for instituting the modern income tax. And I suppose it begs the question how he'd feel about a government shutdown. I feel pretty confident that he'd get into his favorite automobile, find his way to Capitol Hill as quickly as he could, and at least have a chat with the likes of Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and William Jennings Bryan. Scott Berg's biography will take you through Tommy Wilson's life before he became known as Woodrow, through his time as president of Princeton University, his swift election as governor of New Jersey, and then to one of the most exciting presidential political races in our country's history in 1912. It then takes us on a journey through Woodrow Wilson's rise and fall as a statesman who led the nation through the war to end all wars, to his tireless efforts at the Paris Peace Conference, which ultimately earned him a Nobel Peace Prize, and to his obsession with the League of Nations, which, although never realized during Wilson's lifetimes, many years later became the United Nations. We discovered that Wilson was also a passionate romantic whose second wife, Edith, was involved in, quote, the greatest cover-up ever perpetrated in the White House. Now that's saying a lot. As she, Dr. Grayson, and Wilson's private secretary, Joseph Tumulty, kept the president's medical condition from the public and even the cabinet and vice president for much of the last 2 years of his second term. Could you imagine such a thing today? Scott Berg shows us how Mrs. Wilson effectively became the first female president of the United States during this period. Throughout his book, we read of President Wilson's greatest successes and ultimately his failures with the United States Congress and the American people. Now that I have finished the book, and I did get choked up when President Wilson died, I told Scott earlier, it reminded me a lot of when President Reagan died. There were a lot of the same emotions, a lot of the same activity going on around me, and it brought back some memories. I can't tell you that I've become a Wilsonite or I'm a follower of Wilsonianism, as Scott terms it, but I can tell you that this is not just a textbook for the classroom. It is a fascinating and powerfully written voyage through the life of Thomas Woodrow Wilson, a patriot, a man of faith, a president willing to take action, and a man beloved by many people in this nation and certainly around the globe. This was an extraordinary period in our country's history, and it's been forgotten for some reason, as well as the world's, the results of which still impact us today in many ways. This rich and enlightening narrative is filled with new and important details, brimming with an emotion that has never been associated with our nation's 28th president. It is my pleasure to introduce Scott Berg, who will tell us of his own journey as he sought to create the 5th piece of the Berg apple pie and explain this leader and this man.
Well, thank you. Thank you, and thank you all for being here. And thank you. I don't know about you, I could have listened to that introduction all night. I was just mesmerized. I thought, oh, who is he? Gosh. Well, thank you. Thank you, Joanne. So yes, I am going to talk about Woodrow Wilson, and I'm just going to take, it just seems at first blush slightly incongruous to be talking about Woodrow Wilson in the House of Reagan here. And yet, even as I was driving up today, I kept thinking, no, there are so many striking parallels, which I will get to in the end. But I want to tell you a little about how and why I got into spending the last 13 years of my life researching and writing about Woodrow Wilson. And I wanted to leave you with a few take-home points. Suddenly I wonder if I have 14 of them. Now, wait a minute. No, I don't, but we'll see. We'll see. But here we go. As you heard in the introduction, I became enamored of F. Scott Fitzgerald when I was 15, but also that very year, my mother handed me a book which was a biography of Woodrow Wilson as well, a rather slender biography of him, and I became so carried away with Wilson that I put his picture up on the wall right next to F. Scott Fitzgerald's. And in fact, I had 3 portraits on my wall: Fitzgerald, Wilson, and Don Quixote. I was 15 now. I was 15. And then when I was 16, it occurred to me that 2 out of the 3 had gone to Princeton. And so that was the second reason I went there. Don Quixote, if you didn't know, did not get into Princeton. Terrible board scores, they say, and so he didn't make it. In any case, now I want to get up to Woodrow Wilson as quickly as possible. So I did go to Princeton, and I did write my first book on Max Perkins, Fitzgerald's book editor, and that began as my senior thesis, became a book, and indeed, while writing that, I began to think of the apple pie. And so after having written about an East Coast figure, a West Coast figure, a Midwestern figure, it then occurred to me I would like to write about a Southern figure, and most people don't realize that Woodrow Wilson was from the South, which I will talk about in a moment. And I had not written about a figure from the world of politics and government, and indeed higher education, which is an extremely important part of American culture, to say the least, and was a hugely important part of Woodrow Wilson's life. So that's what brings me here and now. So let's talk a little about Woodrow Wilson. And thank you again. That was just a wonderful, wonderful setup for everything I wanted to talk about tonight. So let me start by running on a platform. I have 2 planks I'm going to run on. I'm going to say them, and you're going to hear them, and you're going to immediately say, "Oh no, I can refute that." But I hope you'll try. Even more, I hope that you can't, and I hope to convince you in the next few minutes. If I don't convince you of these 2 planks I'm going to run on, then I hope you'll read the book and you'll see it amply supported for 750 pages. And if that doesn't convince you, well, I'm terribly sorry. That's the best I can do. So here we go. Here we go. I believe Woodrow Wilson is the most influential man of the 20th century. I think he exerted more influence that, in fact, we live with today. The second thing I am positing tonight, as I think I make clear in the book, I certainly believe this. This is a little more subjective even. And that is, I believe Woodrow Wilson's personal life was the most compelling drama ever to unfold in the White House. And so here we go. And the second one, I should start by saying, really in some ways intrigued me more than the first. And it's something I really tried to convey in my book. It's something I hadn't seen in other presidential biographies, and it's something I try to do in all my biographies. And that is to personalize the subject. There's a tendency, especially in presidential biographies, to talk about all the greatness of the presidential figure, and then the biographer will sort of throw in, oh, by the way, he had a wife and 3 children, and, as if those were just the tail on the dog. And what I wanted to do with Wilson especially, because he was so deeply emotional, because he was, contrary to most pictures of him, an extremely passionate man, I wanted to build his story from the ground up. I wanted you to see his DNA. I wanted you to see what his emotional background was, such that as he travels through history, as he does, you will see how the emotional life really influenced not just his professional decisions, but in fact really helped shape the world we live in today in the 21st century. So, I'm going to throw out a few points tonight, these things that you can take home with you, I think. They're just a few bullet points, really, some of which Joanne here referred to, but I want to perhaps flesh out a few of them. Here's the first thing to remember about Woodrow Wilson. He is the first Southern president that we had since the Civil War. This was extremely important. This was a man. He was born, Tommy Wilson, he was born in 1856 in Virginia. His father was a Presbyterian minister who moved around the South. So young Tommy was raised in 4 southern states. He remembered the Civil War. The very first memory Woodrow Wilson had, he was not yet 4 years old, but in November of 1860, living in Augusta, Georgia, real southern town, he remembered a lot of hubbub outside the house, outside the minister's manse where he grew up. And he went outside. Now, he's not even 4 years old, but he remembers this for the rest of his life. And what they're all buzzing about is, Lincoln got elected, there's going to be a war. And indeed, there was a war. And you read other books about Woodrow Wilson, and this incident usually doesn't even get mentioned. I found it such a defining moment for Woodrow Wilson because he talked about it for the rest of his life. He carried it with him. And indeed, this one little moment in Augusta in 1860 is going to travel with him all the way to the White House when he has to decide whether the nation he is presiding over is going to enter a great war. And so Wilson, you see, remembered the Civil War itself. He saw his father's church turned into a hospital. He saw neighbors return maimed. He saw a lot of neighbors who did not even return. He saw the privation, the deprivation that his family, that his neighbors all went through because of the war. After the war, during Reconstruction, which he remembered vividly, his family had moved to Columbia, South Carolina, which was still charred. Much of that city was burned down, and much of it had not been rebuilt, had not been reconstructed. Wilson, young boy, took all these images with him. He is the only president of the United States who was ever born in a country that had lost a war. He grew up in the Confederate States of America, and they lost a war, and he carried that with him. It's big. It was traumatic. It had psychological implications that are then going to have for him professional implications. So carry that with you. The second thing is that Woodrow Wilson was the most educated president we ever had. Period. That's simple, undeniable. I hesitated. I didn't say he was the most intellectual president we ever had. I don't think one could ever forget Thomas Jefferson. And I'm sure if we all went through the roster of the presidents, we could find a few who might be a good intellectual match for Woodrow Wilson. But nobody had the education, the formal education he had. You know, Presbyterianism, and Wilson was the son, the grandson, the great-grandson. You could go back generations, and there were all these Presbyterian ministers in his family tree. If you shake the branches of the Woodrow tree and the Wilson tree, a lot of ministers are going to fall down. They were there. And Presbyterianism from its founding really wedded religion with education and also with politics. It was a big part of that religion. So here's Wilson. He goes off to college. He goes north. He goes to New Jersey, where he studies at the College of New Jersey, what later changed its name to Princeton University. He was a very good student. He wasn't the best, but he was very good. He had his finger in every pot on that campus. Whatever was going on, he was somehow involved, except for the fact that it was an extremely socially exclusive place. It was a campus really for the sons of the very rich in this country, and Wilson was the son of a poor Presbyterian minister. And Wilson was not invited to join all of the exclusive clubs that he would have liked to, perhaps. But again, he took this with him as well. But to go back to his education, and I'll pick up those social points in a moment, the education that he got most, the one where he really excelled, was outside the classroom because he did a lot of extracurricular, independent reading and writing. So much so that just within weeks of his graduation from college, 21 years old, he published his first essay on politics. It was a major piece, and it was published in a very prestigious New England journal, which ironically, and if you know the end of the story, you will really hear the irony, this piece that he submitted at age 21 was edited by a young Bostonian who was just about to run for state office for the first time, his name Henry Cabot Lodge. It would not be the last time that Henry Cabot Lodge would go over Woodrow Wilson's writings. In any case, Wilson was a published author already, so here he was. Now, he was already thinking about a political career for himself, even though he felt you really needed money and some family background, some power, some prestige to your family. Again, neither of which he had. But he figured he would try getting ahead as far as he could in this world, and he reckoned that most people who went into politics were lawyers. And he also noted that most of America's presidents had come from the state of Virginia. And so Wilson enrolled at the University of Virginia Law School, where he studied law, and after a while he left to open his own practice in Atlanta, Georgia, which he thought was the most interesting boom town after the Civil War. Returned to the South he did. You can't go home again, but he went back to the South, which he really knew. And there he had this law practice for the next year and a half. And Woodrow Wilson proved to be an absolutely terrible lawyer. I mean, just terrible. Well, maybe I shouldn't even say he was terrible because he never had the chance to prove it, because in all that time, he had no clients. He found none, not one client. He spent his days just reading and writing mostly about politics. And he would submit op-eds, letters to the editor, anybody, essays to journals, anyone who would read it, anyone who would buy it. And that was that. He had one job. He got one assignment, and that was a job that his mother got for him. And it was, she had inherited some property and she needed a little legal work done, and it warranted his going to a town called Rome, Georgia, to do all the legal work, which he did. So off he went, and there in Rome, Georgia, this Presbyterian minister's son met the local Presbyterian minister's daughter, a beautiful girl named Ellen Louise Axon, and they fell in love, and he immediately wanted to marry her. Now, of course, he didn't have a job, and he didn't have a career. He didn't even have a notion about what his future might be, but he was in love with this woman. And fortunately for the biographer, because it was going to take him a while to get some footing, to have some way of supporting a wife and perhaps a family someday, they wrote letters to each other. They wrote the most passionate love letters I have ever read. I have read the Brownings, I have read the Adamses, I have not read anything like the thousands of love letters, thousands, between Woodrow Wilson, yes, Woodrow Wilson, and Ellen Louise Axon. I mean, there were so many of these letters. Some of them that Woodrow Wilson wrote went on for 15 pages, just saying, I mean, how many ways can you say I love you? I mean, they got sickening. At a certain point, you could only take so much of it. I could only take, and there were days I was doing research going through them, and I said, please don't write her another letter today. I just can't take it. Because he would finish a letter, and then a few hours later, he'd write her another letter. Well, how much can you say? In any case, this is interesting, because this is this personal thread again. And whether the love story is extremely important, and I think it is, it bespeaks something else. And that was, this was a man who would become president who carried a lot of emotion with him. And not only that, but he was not afraid to articulate it. This truly was a man of passion. And we have not always had presidents who were men, and maybe someday women, of great passion. Wilson, you must remember, always carried that with him. Now, he, in order to basically start his married life, he entered academia. He went to Johns Hopkins University, where he became one of the first students in a new field called political science. Woodrow Wilson became one of the first political scientists in this country. He began writing his PhD dissertation, and it was then that he got his first job offer, which was to teach at a new college called Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. The day this all-female college opened its doors, Professor Woodrow Wilson was one of the first teachers there. He was right there, opening day. He taught there for a few years, not very happily, because teaching women at the university level was still something of a novelty in the 1880s. Mrs. Wilson wasn't crazy about it either, I should add. And he moved on to Wesleyan College in Connecticut, and then he got the call he had been waiting for, if indeed he was going to give up political dreams, as he was starting to do, so that he could really have a career in academia. And the call he awaited was the return to his alma mater. And he was offered a job to teach at Princeton. And back he went in 1890. And as he had as an undergraduate, he took the campus by storm. He was a professor there for the next 20 years. After 12 of those years, the university realized this man, Woodrow Wilson, he had dropped the Tommy by now, was indispensable to that community. So much so that they thought it was time to get rid of their current president, a man who used to boast that he ran the greatest country club in America. And they felt, as Wilson felt, it was time to turn this into the greatest college in America. And so, by unanimous vote of the Board of Trustees, Woodrow Wilson became the president of Princeton University in 1902. And then he not only, almost overnight, reformed education on that campus, he reformed college education in this country, such so that it has become the model for colleges today. If you went to a college or know someone who went to a college in which you majored in a subject, in which there was a sequence of courses within that major, maybe you took some electives to complement the major, you had 2 lectures a week, and then you broke down into a smaller class, maybe with a teaching assistant or a young professor. If you maybe had an honor code, That is the Wilsonian model. All those elements Woodrow Wilson put together to create what he thought American higher education should be like. And indeed, that is the existing model in most colleges in this country today. Now, after taking that on, Wilson was so successful, he thought, now I really want to take on something equally important, and that is the social aspect of this campus. Let's go back to the personal thread here. His undergraduate days, being a poor minister's son, he wanted to get rid of these very exclusive eating clubs on the campus. And he launched a major campaign to do this, and he spoke about it in a most compelling manner. So much so that he wasn't just talking about a few fraternity houses, basically, on one campus. He was talking about the social structure of the United States, and he was talking about the role academia played in the United States. And the big question was, should a college education be something strictly for the very rich, or should this be a great tool that any American can use to get ahead, to use to jump classes, if you will, even though we like to think we don't have classes in this country? And it was at this point the trustees of Princeton said, that's just about enough, Professor Wilson. Let's take a little time out. You've done a lot of wonderful work here, but maybe it's time just to take a pause. And indeed, he was about to get the boot from Princeton. And he began to think about what he might do next. And before he even had to think, something just fell from the heavens. And here's what it was. In 1910, now you're going to have to accept a big thesis here. In 1910, the state of New Jersey, if you can accept this, was the most corrupt state in the United States. All right? Give me this one. Just give me this one. The reason they were the most corrupt is they had the most corrupt political machine in the United States, which was the Democratic Party of New Jersey. And it was run by a very powerful few men, one in particular. It was so corrupt that they knew how corrupt they were. And they began to talk amongst themselves and say, what we need in this state for this party is a puppet. We need a really malleable puppet. Why don't we look for the cleanest reputation in all of New Jersey? What about that professor at Princeton, who's making all this noise about selectivity and exclusivity, and he talks sort of like a progressive, and yet he's just a college professor, Let's get him. Let's go to him. Let's make him an offer he can't refuse. Let's offer him the governorship of New Jersey. And they did offer it to him. They offered him the nomination. Wilson accepted it. He got the nomination. He ran in 1910, and he won in a landslide. Had never run for anything in his life. And now Woodrow Wilson is the governor of New Jersey. Takes office in 1911. The first thing he does as governor, he kicks out the machine. I mean, physically barred the Democratic machine from entering state buildings. And now everybody in the country is looking at New Jersey and saying, who is this man? Overnight, he has broken this powerful machine. And that's where things just began. Because then what Wilson did over the next 18 months was introduce the most progressive political agenda of any state in the country. And now, everybody in the country is looking at New Jersey, but most especially, the Democratic Party of the United States is looking at New Jersey. They, whose standard bearer at that point was William Jennings Bryan, who had lost 3 presidential elections. The Democrats knew they needed a new face. Who better than this guy with no Washington baggage, this guy who knows how to push an agenda through and has broken the machine? Well, my God, he was tailor-made. So there was a very dramatic convention in 1912, but Woodrow Wilson, at the end of the day, it's one of the most exciting political stories, that particular convention. But Wilson received the Democratic nomination, and as you heard in the introduction, but I know all of you knew it anyway, 1912 was one of the great elections in this country, really exciting, in which we had Wilson, the Democrat, running against William Howard Taft, the sitting incumbent, the sitting Republican president, generally sitting because he weighed 340 pounds. But we had him, and we had Teddy Roosevelt, who bolted from the Republican Party to form the Progressive Bull Moose. And then just to add a little spice, Eugene Debs ran as a socialist. Not that he was going to win, but even people who didn't agree with Debs, they respected him. And so he added some very interesting rhetoric to this four-way race, which was kind of exciting, which Woodrow Wilson won in an electoral landslide. It was the greatest electoral landslide the country had yet seen. And now Woodrow Wilson is president. Takes office 100 years ago, this year, 1913. There he is. So Wilson, you see, enjoyed the most meteoric rise in American history, period. In October of 1910, he had been the president of a small college in New Jersey. In November of 1912, he's elected president of the United States. It's absolutely extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And he took the country by storm. Over the next 2 or 3 years, he proposed and got passed, again, the most progressive political agenda the country had seen. And you heard some of the things he did in that period. But it involved lowering taxes. It involved the modern income tax, a graduated tax, which he thought was fairer. It was a redistribution of wealth, and he thought it was a fairer way to deal with the lower and middle classes. He did put the first Jew on the court. He introduced the Federal Reserve System, which has been the basis of our economy for the last century. So there was that. There was the 8-hour workday, workman's compensation. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And it was not just the agenda that was so important. It was the way he presented it and got it passed. And in doing that, Woodrow Wilson really redefined the role of the modern president. Wilson, as a political scientist, knew the least defined job in the entire Constitution is the presidency. It says very little about what the president does, which Wilson interpreted as he can do whatever he wants until somebody tells him he can't. And the someone would be either the Congress or the Supreme Court. And that's what propelled Wilson to keep proposing things. But here's what he did, and here's a great lesson for today and for all modern presidents for that matter. And it's somewhat appropriate, actually, to President Reagan. And it has to do with this. Wilson believed, rather the way I tried to humanize him in my book, he believed he as president should humanize the White House. He should put a personal face on it. He wanted the Congress to know, he wanted the country to know. There was a man who lived in that house who was coming up with ideas and proposing them. And so, for the last 100 years, we have this great tradition once a year where the president shows up for the State of the Union address and, all rise, and, and great, and we're all friends for 2 hours. But Woodrow Wilson was the first president to do that since John Adams in 1800. 112 years had passed before a president had set foot in the Congress to conduct business. And Wilson thought this was extremely important, not just for the State of the Union. Whenever he had an important piece of legislation to propose, he would call a joint session of Congress. In the summers in Washington, it didn't matter to him. He called joint sessions, 25 joint sessions he called while he was President of the United States. And then he did something even more extraordinary. He would show up the next day, and he'd show up the day after that, and the day after that. And he worked out of a little room in the Congress that some people who work in Congress don't even know exists. And they don't know it exists because it has a very confusing name. It's called the President's Room. And it's a room that Washington even thought should be incorporated in the Capitol. A room in which the president could have a satellite office and show up on any given day at any given time, basically to grab lawmakers as they walked off the Senate floor, sit them down, talk about it. In Woodrow Wilson's case, sometimes he'd show up 5 days a week, and he would basically run a little class the way he did at Princeton, and he would give a lesson in political science. But what he did, and he didn't always get what he wanted by any means, but what Wilson successfully did was he created a conversation. He had sustained dialogue between the legislative branch and the executive branch. Because you see, Wilson, here's another crazy notion, had this crazy idea that the two, you're not going to believe this, that the two branches of government, those two branches, should cooperate. And I mean that quite literally, that they should cooperate the government. And perhaps the most successful successor to do that is President Reagan himself, who kept a dialogue going, even with the vehement disagreements with the opposite party. And I know you just had Chris Matthews here last night talking about this extraordinary relationship that existed. But so much of that, you see, was because President Reagan himself humanized the office. And he knew how to use his charm as well as his intelligence and as well as his own political agenda. But what he managed to do, you see, was to keep the dialogue going. And that is an extremely important and compelling piece of being the chief executive, if you're going to be a successful one, I think. Now, most of Wilson's first term was devoted to this domestic agenda, except there were two cataclysms that almost derailed everything. The first is his beloved wife, Ellen, the recipient of the thousands of love letters, died the first year in office. She died in the White House. Wilson was distraught, extremely depressed, could barely get out of bed, was talking about resigning. He just couldn't go on. But the second cataclysm did get him out of bed, and that was the very week that Ellen Wilson died, war broke out in Europe. And now duty, if nothing else, compelled the President of the United States to get to work, to do whatever he could to keep his country out of war. Go back, Tommy Wilson, first memory, there's going to be a war. And now, for the next 3 years, Woodrow Wilson did everything diplomatically possible to keep the United States out of the First World War. By 1917, having been reelected on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," in also one of the great squeaker elections. 1916 is just, I mean, they didn't know for weeks who had actually won, when Wilson ran against Charles Evans Hughes. But Wilson did win for keeping us out of war, and in April of 1917, Wilson appeared before a joint session of Congress, where he asked for a declaration of war against Germany, which had been relentless over the last few years. They just kept torpedoing even neutral ships. American lives were being lost. Ships such as the Lusitania were going down. They were not responding to dozens and dozens of notes that Wilson would send back and forth. And finally, it became inevitable. Wilson believed, largely because of morality of his own, that he began to impose upon a nation that the country did have to go to war. And on April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson delivered what may very well be the most important foreign policy speech in this country's history. And within it was one sentence. And that one sentence has been, in fact, the bedrock of all American foreign policy to this day. And the sentence is, as you know, if you had a good high school social studies teacher, the world must be made safe for democracy. And it's as simple as that. And just a few weeks ago, President Obama was in front of the public, in front of the press, talking about Syria, and he raised a few questions. He talked about Iraq and Afghanistan and whether the United States had a role as the policeman of the world. But then he said, on the other hand, can the United States just close its eyes to a dictator that is gassing and killing 1,000 of its people when children are dying? Can the United States morally look the other way? In essence, he was asking the identical questions Woodrow Wilson had raised in 1917, when Wilson himself introduced this great moral component to American foreign policy. Of course, we went to war. Woodrow Wilson proved to be an outstanding commander-in-chief. We, who had an army the size of that of Portugal's, within a year and a half had mobilized an army of 2 million men and sent them across the Atlantic Ocean. After just 6 months of actually Americans fighting, the war was won. And Wilson really committed this country to that war for one overriding reason, and that was, beyond the morality, what that was leading to was, if we could win that war, we could dictate the terms of the peace. And indeed, Wilson did come up with 14 points. Some of them were very mechanical, but the 14th point had nothing mechanical about it. It was pure idealism. He was practical about it, but it was very idealistic. And it was an idea for the establishment of something called the League of Nations. And Woodrow Wilson went to Paris to basically be the head of our committee that was going to negotiate this great peace. And get this, the President of the United States was gone for 6 months. For 6 months, the President was not here. He was living in Paris and was showing up at 5 meetings a day to get this treaty written just so it could embody this League of Nations. And finally, he came home in the summer of 1919, where he found an extremely belligerent and increasingly Republican Congress, the Senate especially, which has to ratify treaties, that wanted no part of it. And as a result of that, Woodrow Wilson embarked on what may be the most quixotic quest in American history. He decided to take his case to the people. And this was at a moment before radio. This was at a moment before airplanes could take him around the country. And he embarked on a 29-city tour around the country. After about half of the tour was done, sometimes giving 5 speeches a day, he collapsed. His doctor had not fully revealed to him the extent of his arteriosclerosis, but he finally said to Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, "This tour is over. We're going back to Washington as quickly as possible." And 3 days later, the President of the United States suffered a stroke. And here, the story really gets good. Because the greatest conspiracy to engulf the White House then began, which is the second Mrs. Wilson. Oh, yes, after the first one died, he met an attractive young widow in Washington. Within a year, he began courting her. He sent her hundreds of the most passionate love letters, you have ever read. I mean, they made the other ones look sick. They were child's play, you know. These were the letters of a mature lover, you know, and they were really something, these letters. I mean, really something. But the second Mrs. Wilson and a handful of doctors decided amongst themselves to tell nobody beyond the confines of the second story of the White House that the president had suffered a stroke. And so they carried on for the next 18 months. Virtually nobody ever saw the president. After a while, and I should tell you, he could speak and he did not lose his mind. He was paralyzed. His emotions were all over the place, as often happens after strokes. His judgment was quite faulty very often, but nobody saw the president without passing first through Mrs. Wilson. No document, no appointment, nothing that required a signature got to the president without Mrs. Wilson first vetting it and deciding what the president should even see, to say nothing of what the president should say. And this is the way they carried on until finally Wilson hobbled out of the White House, the lamest duck this country has ever had, you know, with the exception, obviously, of those who were assassinated. And Woodrow Wilson remained in Washington, where he has really one of the most tragic endings of any leader we've ever had. Someone who just faded away emotionally, physically, mentally, except for one thing, and that is Warren Harding, who succeeded Wilson and almost immediately revealed personal and professional corruption and immorality, and suddenly there was a longing for Woodrow Wilson again. And every afternoon he'd take a drive with his wife and they'd ride out around Washington, and there'd be 10 people standing out front just wanting to get a look at Woodrow Wilson. And the next day there'd be 20 people. A few months later, there might be 50 people. On November 11th, of 1921, this is now the first celebration of the armistice that the Wilsons are not in the White House, there were 1,000 people out there. The next year, 10,000. The next year, 20,000 people. Wilson, the Wilson House, had become this shrine. People were coming from all over the world to see this man. And it wasn't just for the ideals. I think a lot of it had to do with some of the things we also saw with President Reagan, and that is people felt a great familiarity. Even though Wilson seemed to be standoffish, one can't forget, and I really want to just draw these few similarities. Both Wilson and Reagan were the great communicators of their day, and they used that power of communication to have a conversation with the country. And so even when people disagreed with Ronald Reagan or disagreed with Woodrow Wilson, they knew where each of those men stood because they were both men of conviction. And so they spoke, you see, from the mind and the heart. And it was a most telling and surprising piece of information to me when I first learned that Ronald Reagan wrote his own radio addresses. This was quite something because I found them very compelling. And they were compelling because they came right from here through here down here. And so it was with Wilson, who actually was the last president to have written every speech he ever gave. He had no speechwriters, period. Well, we are not put into this world to sit still and know, said Woodrow Wilson. We are put in it to act. And I hope each of you will at least take a few minutes, maybe hours, maybe days, to sit still long enough to know a little more about Woodrow Wilson. And then maybe act. Maybe just the action is to remember, maybe spread the word about this man. Because whether you like him or not, whether you agree with him or not, we live in a world today that is of Woodrow Wilson's making. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.
Wow. I read the book, and that was as exciting the second time as it was the first. I know that Scott has agreed to take some questions, and we have some microphones in the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll get you a microphone. That's really important because we are taping this program. My first question is, I wonder if we could get President Obama the key to the president's room at the Capitol and get him directions on how to get there?
Well, yeah, I should tell you, first of all, the room is locked up. It's just extraordinary. It is this exquisite little jewel of a room. It is 20 feet off of the Senate floor. And in fact, on March 4th of this year, March 4th being the former date on which presidents were inaugurated in this country before Franklin Roosevelt, I wrote an op-ed piece in which basically it was a kind of open letter to President Obama saying, get thee to the president's room. If only symbolically, it suggests you want to open this dialogue. I was just getting tired of seeing a president lurching from crisis to crisis, as we're doing this week. Whereas, and I'm not saying that's the magic pill, but I'm saying at least if there's a dialogue going on, everybody knows where everybody stands all the time, and there's fluidity, as opposed to the rigidity that we now have, because people now have to dig their heels in. So I wish he would get there. Wilson went so far that at one point he even suggested, why doesn't the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hold a meeting here at the White House? I'll serve you all lunch, which he did. And he sat in on this meeting. That's the way this man functioned. Now, part of it was, I like to say, and this is true, Wilson didn't really want to be president of the United States. He really wanted to be prime minister. What he really hoped was that he could have a legislature completely behind him. And one doesn't always get that. But I agree with you. I wish the president would, our current president, would get down there and do that.
We do have some questions. We'll start with Lou.
Mr. Berg, I'm a great admirer of Wilson, but I've always thought that the blot on his presidency was the introduction of the segregationist practices in the White House. I understand the historic reasons why, but I think just as all the things you're saying that he was influential on segregation in a very harmful way to this country. Can you discuss that?
Yes, and I'm really glad you raised this. I was looking at my watch thinking, do I have time to get into this or not? And yes, I'm glad we can. It is one of the great ironies in retrospect, and here we are 100 years later, that the most progressive president to that date was also the most regressive when it came to civil rights. And indeed, just to do the headline, Woodrow Wilson did introduce Jim Crow segregation to Washington, D.C., which was then a small southern town, at the behest of his Secretary of the Treasury and the Postmaster General, which had made a few inroads in integration of those two offices. The new secretaries, who were both rather extreme racists, said to Wilson they really wanted segregation reimposed, which Wilson went along with. He didn't think it up, he didn't invent segregation, but he certainly went along with it. It's on his watch, he broke it, he's got to buy it. So there's no question about that. Now, the reasons, a lot of it, of course, let's go back to thread number one, first Southern president. Another irony is the African American vote in 1912 went for Woodrow Wilson. And it was a little for the same reason that Richard Nixon used to say it took me to go to China. The man who opposed Red China all those years, it took his visit to do it. So it was the blacks thought that Woodrow Wilson, a man steeped in the South, would be the best person basically to advance African Americans in American society. He was very mindful of the situation. In his mind, he did think integration was ultimately a good thing. Time and again, he said, he just didn't think the country was ready in 1913. He saw incidents wherever there had been integration in which fights would break out. he was getting letters from both sides, especially people from the North saying, how can you go backwards when we've started to integrate? And Wilson would say, you don't understand what it's like in this small southern town. And people in the South would say, Mr. President, how can you keep appointing blacks to judgeships? You know, how can you give even jobs at all in the Treasury Department of any management level? Don't you realize that means someday a white woman will have to walk in and work for a black boss? That's simply intolerable. And, you know, this is 1913 talk. This is 1913 when members of the Ku Klux Klan proudly, not furtively, but proudly, sat on the Supreme Court or in the Congress. So that's the world Wilson was functioning in. But I try to make it very clear two things. Woodrow Wilson's introduction of segregation in Washington, first of all, sanctioned it everywhere in the country, needless to say. If the federal government can do it, any state can do it, and that was that. The second thing, I think, is that Wilson, I think, made a political choice in the end. Wilson came in, and I think this is the ultimate explanation, beyond everything I've just said, which is mighty important, but if there was even a scintilla of doubt, Wilson had this very aggressive, progressive agenda, the New Freedom, he called it, which was all about leveling the playing field. Now, the Southern Congress, or the one-third of the Congress, which was Southern and Democratic, solidly Democratic, made it very clear to Wilson in the first month, if you are even thinking of getting any of this passed and integrating this country any further, you are going to go nowhere. Nothing will get done. And literally, I mean, I name names. I mean, there are the powerful congressmen and senators who said just that much, you know, and you've really even got to stop appointing positions that have been traditionally given to blacks. And Wilson did override a few of those things they wanted, but he knew he had to segregate if he wanted to get any of the New Freedom passed. So I think that's kind of the ultimate answer. But make no mistake about it, I wanted to say one other final thing. And it's very easy to look back 100 years and say, oh, well, you know, things were different then. And they were. And Wilson was a centrist in his day. He really was just down the middle of what this country was on race relations. That being said, as again I make very clear in the book, his thoughts, his sentiments, his speeches were racist. He judged a man by the color of his skin, not the content of his character.
We have a question back there.
Thank you, Scott. Wonderful book. I can't wait to get into it.
Thank you.
I want to give you these two quick points. Gene Debs is one of my personal heroes.
Yes?
And I know he got locked up for a very mild anti-war speech in Ohio.
Correct.
And it took Harding to pardon him. I was always disappointed that Wilson didn't pardon him. Number two, the Treaty of Versailles. I know France wanted to turn Germany into a desert.
Yes.
How hard did he fight? I know they all say that World War I spawned World War II. Everybody says that, okay. But how hard did he fight at Versailles to stop France from actually sealing its own doom, because, you know, they got conquered in World War II. How hard did he fight there to stop Clemenceau from turning Germany into a desert?
Right. Well, those are two good big questions. The first one, just to talk about Debs, yes, while Wilson was the most progressive and also regressive when it came to race relations, he was also the most suppressive president we had, because during the war he did introduce the Alien and Sedition Acts that John Adams had first come up with, some of which Lincoln had used during the Civil War. But Wilson really clamped down hard on free speech, perhaps more than any president in history, in fact. And Debs became the most famous victim of that clamping down. And you're quite correct. Debs gave this speech. I've read it 12, 20 times. I keep looking for the sedition in it. It's pretty tough to find. He basically was telling people they didn't have to go fight. He was telling young men, you don't have to go abroad and fight in this capitalist war if you don't want to. Well, Wilson found that intolerable. While 2 million men were over there shedding blood, that somebody should be doing this back at home, he found completely unacceptable. Now again, to give him the cover he is due, these cases went to the Supreme Court, which were all 9-0 in favor of sending the likes of Debs to jail. Now, here's where things get bad, I think, about Woodrow Wilson, or badder. They get really worse. And that is, the war is over. The very people in the Wilson administration who sent Debs to jail came to Wilson and said, you know what? He's in his 70s now. He's quite ill. He's served several years. It's time to pardon him. The war is over. And we have written up the pardon for you. And Wilson took out his pen and where his signature would go, wrote denied. And that was that. That was in the moment before Wilson left office. He could not get over that Debs was speaking the way he did while young men were dying.
And he walked out of the Atlanta prison and gave him a standing ovation in prison.
That is correct. It's a great moment. And indeed, you're quite correct. One of the very first things Harding did was pardon Debs. And he not only pardoned him, you see, but he got to do a real slap in Wilson's face with a dead fish. You know, I mean, it was just, gee, now it takes Warren Harding to let the greatest socialist in the country out of prison. So that was really, I think even worse than the race issue with Wilson, I think this suppression of free speech is perhaps the darkest mark against Wilson on the record. Now, as for your other really simple question about the ending of World War I and the Treaty of Paris and Wilson dealing with the French especially, Wilson, honestly, and I've been through all the minutes, the letters, the correspondence, I think Wilson did everything any president could have done. I do believe that. The thing he kept saying from the minute he arrived and encountered Clemenceau of France, and Lloyd George of England for that matter, was, because he was just as bad. Actually, in some ways, he was worse than Clemenceau, because Lloyd George was heading a coalition government, and so he was going back and forth every other week on what he really wanted or what he said the country wanted. But from the very start, Wilson said, if you punish the Germans too severely, and this goes right back to the Civil War, I mean, this boy carried all this with him. He carried Reconstruction with him. If you punish them too severely, said Wilson, these same countries will go to war in 25 years. And if you get out your calendars, he got it almost to the Monday when war would break out again. You know, the other thing you have to remember, when Wilson went over to Paris for 6 months, there were 24 other nations there in on this treaty. They all had very long agendas of all the territory they wanted back, Alsace-Lorraine, we want the Saar, they wanted that, and they wanted money. They wanted restitution, they wanted reparations. 24 countries all wanted that. We arrived, we wanted none of that. Wilson made it clear, he kept saying, I am not here for territory or treasure. I am here for one thing. And basically, it was to get his League of Nations instated. Now, toward the end, indeed, while it's becoming his 5th and 6th month away from home, he starts to make concessions. And because he's got to get home. The concessions he made were not really, though, about restitution and punishing Germany at that point. There were other matters involved. And the other thing you have to remember when this argument comes up, that World War I caused World War II and Wilson's being weak, the treaty called for Germany to repay 5 billion pounds and change, which was not an onerous bill for Germany at that point, in fact. And the further truth is, at the end of the day, the Germans never paid it anyway. They only paid 20% of it, and they were quite capable of paying all of it almost at once, in fact, but they didn't. So there were certainly other mitigating reasons for World War II to have happened. Is that one of them? Of course it is. And were they humiliated? Yes, of course they were. And did they have to pay anything? Yes, they did. So it's a factor, but I don't think it's the major factor.
Thank you. We have a question here. And then after that, we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Good evening. You mentioned right when you began that Wilson was really a man that changed the 20th century.
Yes.
What I never hear people talk about is that Wilson, along with these other things that he made, was also the National Park Service, and I would agree with that, in 1916.
Quite right.
And before that, of course, there had been many parks, Yellowstone, Sequoia, Yosemite, Statue of Liberty in 1886. But of course, Theodore Roosevelt, Taft never had done that. Was Wilson a naturalist in any respect, or was this really just the Department of the Interior in 1849 coming in and saying, we're going to have this?
It's a fair question. I would not call Wilson a naturalist, but you raise a very good point, though, and that is Wilson put aside far more parkland than Teddy Roosevelt did. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, make no mistake about it, was a major force in this and really got the ball rolling. But Wilson really picked the ball up and ran with it. But here is the underlying theme to Wilson on conservation in general. And it's the same theme that runs through everything in the New Freedom, whether it's the graduated income tax or the Federal Reserve System for that matter. And it's the same theme that runs through his presidency at Princeton, trying to get rid of the exclusive eating clubs. He was a trust buster. And he basically believed he wasn't anti-business, he wasn't anti-big business even. But what he was against was unfair gaming of situations. He was against unfair advantages. And so what Wilson always said about the parks, his basic theme was he wanted to do what would serve the most people. And so putting aside parkland, you see, just to name one thing, conservation of all these sorts, as long as it was not benefiting a monopoly, you see, but could be open to the most people, that was a law he would be for, whether it had to do with Federal Reserve or had to do with parkland, or preserving Canadian geese who flew over, into America. If those geese were good for a lot of Americans, then he was for those geese. Last question.
Mr. Berg, it's a pleasure to see you again. I had the privilege of hearing you at Lindbergh at the UCLA Book Fair.
Oh, how nice. Well, thank you for remembering.
Thank you. My question is about Edith and about how Wilson was distracted in his courting, where the nations of Europe, especially Russia and Austria-Hungary and France and Great Britain and so forth, were going to war in July, August 1914. How much of a distraction was that in trying to carry on world business?
Well, in 1914, he was still very much in mourning. I mean, that's when his first wife, Ellen, dies. And so through 1914, the biggest distraction was dealing with his severe depression, which was marked. I mean, anybody who went into the White House, and a lot of these new letters that I came into, which had belonged to one of his daughters, it talks about that extensively, just how pathetic it is to see a father, or what we know as the President of the United States, moping around the White House. I mean, he just doesn't know what to do. Now, by 1915, when he meets Mrs. Galt, Edith Bowling Galt, and begins courting her, he comes alive again. But I should answer for the first part, though. He got back into action. He was very active in writing letters and notes to all the leaders, in fact, quite early on, within the first few days, in fact, of the assassination in Sarajevo. Wilson is really in touch with everybody, saying, let's keep a lid on this. There's no reason to go to war about this. And indeed, I should add that Wilson often said, had the League of Nations been in place in 1914, and after Archduke Ferdinand had been assassinated, if all the leaders of Europe had come and sat at the League table, the war would not have happened. And that's a very good possibility. Now, to further answer your question, by 1915, when he's courting Mrs. Galt, I found several instances, and even he found it, that he was so smitten, he was so madly in love, and truly now he's writing 3 love letters a day. I mean, this is really consuming his life until he can get this woman to agree to marry him. And he gave a couple of speeches, one in particular, in which he's talking about, on one hand, getting America, he's starting to prepare America emotionally, at least, for a war. But ships are being torpedoed, and American lives are being lost. Teddy Roosevelt is screaming every day, we've got to get into this war. We look weak if we don't respond appropriately. And Wilson gives a speech, which became quite ridiculed, actually, in which he said, there comes a time where a nation can be too proud to fight. Now, Wilson gave that speech as he is really at the hottest and heaviest part of his courtship. And after he gave the speech, he, of course, writes another letter to Edith saying, I don't even remember what I said up there. And he honestly didn't remember everything he had said, because by the next day, it's the headline everywhere, too proud to fight. Well, you can imagine what Teddy Roosevelt did with that. I mean, that just sent him over the top. So there were these instances until he got his personal life on track. And that was one of the reasons I think he was so insistent that Edith marry him so quickly. And she did not want to get married. She was a rather retiring widow who had never really been in love. And this was just way too much for her, and it was now going to be all in public. She was going to be a famous woman, which she really didn't want. So I would say this courtship had a very strong effect, but I don't think, honestly, at the end of the day, that it adversely affected America's role and ultimate entry into the First World War. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.